It's Friday, September 26th. I'm Brian Walsh, and welcome to This Week in Impact, where I talk with ImpactAlpha journalists and editors about some of the most interesting impact investing stories we featured. This week, I'm joined by editor Amy Cortese and CEO Dennis Price. We'll discuss how investors at New York Climate Week are looking to shake off their doldrums and start deploying capital again. Plus, how attention begins to turn to Brazil in the lead up to COP30. And finally, even for fund managers that shun the label, impact drives portfolio performance. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. To start us off, I'm joined once again by Amy Cortese. Welcome back to the podcast, Amy.
Thanks, Brian, and it was great to see you in New York this week.
It was great to spend time with you during New York Climate Week, which is always a whirlwind. So how are you holding up?
Oh, my feet are a little tired, but we're most of the way through. I feel like I've been in every neighborhood in New York this week.
Yeah, I think I got over 20,000 steps the other day, which is a nice marker of all the shuffling around the city to get to different events. All right, first up, let's set the scene, though, for New York Climate Week, which doesn't happen in a vacuum. It occurs alongside the United Nations General Assembly, at which President Trump spoke about climate change being a hoax. So amid this reversal in the U.S. government's official position on the climate issue, how are investors you spoke with responding?
Yeah, I think most people kind of shook that off, right? I mean, first of all, across the board, everyone I talked to from top VCs down to like the smallest community lenders acknowledged that it's been a very tough year. As we know, a lot of the funding and the incentives that were put into place by the Biden administration have been pulled back, kind of pulling the rug out of a lot of good projects and companies and momentum that had been happening in the clean energy and climate tech space. But what we wrote in our Climate Week preview this week, and which really came through this week at Climate Week, was that people are ready to get back to work. And there's a sense of kind of a new spirit of collaboration where investors and business leaders and people throughout the ecosystem are really looking to work together to look for concrete ways that they can move things forward, even without some of that funding that they had been banking on.
All right, so you mentioned both top VCs and more community level funders. So can you give me examples of different types of investors from each of those buckets and how they're approaching the new reality?
Sure. One of the most high profile was the All Aboard Coalition, which recently announced that they were raising and are close to raising $300 million to co-invest alongside some of the top tier climate tech VCs in an effort to really double down on the most promising climate tech companies, make sure that they have all the funding for this very capital intensive process that they have to go through to, commercialize and really kind of break through and become the next unicorn. So that has gotten a lot of press. Tom Steyer of Galvanize, his investment firm, also recently announced a $1.3 billion credit and capital fund that is looking to finance complex, hard to finance, kind of underserved, like big, hairy decarbonization deals. It's market rate, but it's catalytic in a way that they're going after a layer that not very many people are participating in. And then also this week at Climate Week, Trellis Climate, which is part of the Prime Coalition, and Greenie Re, which is an impact first reinsurance company, they launched kind of a neat new company called Vensurety, which stands for Venture Surety. So surety bonds, don't ask me to explain them, but they're, very common for, in well-established industries where it's kind of like a letter of credit that gives liquidity to a company while, so they don't have to tie up their own capital to, pursue some of the basic things that they have to do. That is a big problem in the climate tech industry when, for example, a firm is going to build its first of a kind plant, or just they're working with novel technology. They don't have that track record. They can't get that kind of financing, so they will be issuing these bonds to these companies to provide them with liquidity so they don't have to tie up their own money while they do this hard work of commercialization.
So it sounds like there are a lot of trends here for big investors that are looking to deploy capital, put their money to work, and are not waiting around any longer.
That's absolutely right. I mean, look, the U.S. is one place in a very big world, and the economics behind the energy transition are really full steam ahead. The low prices of solar, the cost reductions and everything. It's better, cheaper, faster, as Tom Steyer likes to say. So I happened to catch him at one of the Climate Week sessions, and here is how he put it.
Globally in 24, new electricity generation, 93% renewable. So if you think about a competition, 93 to 7, that's not a close fight. If you look at the proposed electricity generation in the United States right now to meet the demands of AI and data centers, where there's a huge argument in the press about 24/7, 365, 4 nines or 5 nines, that's why we need natural gas. Of the proposed new electricity generation, 7% of it in the United States is fossil fuels. So when we think about where we're going as a globe and as a country, this argument, this competition is settled. Fossil fuels are the legacy technology. Electricity is today's overwhelmingly dominant theme.
Okay, so we have some of these big institutional investors providing some big pools of capital to climate tech deals. Tell us more about the community lending side of things.
Yeah, it's funny, Brian. It's kind of two worlds. There's that climate tech, very well financed world, and then there is this, community scale, like smaller scale, low income focused and justice focused ecosystem of lenders and funders. I think everything I said applies to them as well. They're coming out of this. They're feeling ready to get back to work. They're very focused on how to move things along. And I think at Climate Week, there were a lot of closed door talks where, getting funders in a room with some of the initiatives that are being pulled together. And I think we'll start hearing about more of some of those very soon. We previewed one of them, Impact Assets, working with a bunch of family offices, is trying to rally funders around something that can help get some of these smaller green bank deals off the ground. So there are a number of efforts underway. And I will say, I talked to a lot of those people this week, and I think for them it was a very emotional week, like very cathartic in a way, but feeling stronger, feeling ready, and as I said, feeling very focused, wanting to look at like very concrete things that they can get done, because of course, like no one's going to fill the giant, massive hole left that the Biden era funding would have provided, but there are a lot of very concrete things that they can do.
So, Amy, what were some of the other themes of New York Climate Week this year, and what happens next?
Yeah, well, Brian, as we heard, it's a sprawling event that takes place all over the city. There were 1,000 events this year. So some of the things I went to touched on AI and responsible tech, and how do we shape that for outcomes that are better for people and the planet. There was a lot on nature-based solutions, and of course, Brazil will be talking a lot more about that at COP30. There were lots of demos, climate tech startups demoing in front of investors, and I went to a session like that on FOAK, which stands for First of a Kind Projects, and that, as we were talking about, are there's hard to finance, like kind of risky first time plants, and that was a very big track this year. And, there was nuclear, there was, just everything under the sun.
Okay, so it sounds like a very bright future for climate tech, a lot of promising technologies and possibilities out there.
Exactly. I think some of the challenges that lie ahead are permitting and modernizing our aging grid, and then of course the financing for the hard to finance sectors. And we'll be covering that in the weeks and months ahead.
And in the weeks and months ahead, the attention in the climate community shifts to Brazil, which is going to be hosting COP30 in a few months. So tell us a little bit about that. Give us a little preview.
Yeah. So it was an interesting backdrop to Climate Week, which honestly is the main event, right, is the UN General Assembly. And all the world leaders were there. It creates a lot of gridlock, especially on the east side. But we had Trump take the stage and during Climate Week call it the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world. Lula, Brazil's leader, in contrast, was a really refreshing beacon who came out in defense of multilateralism and democracy and climate action. So, I think everybody and UNGA and Climate Week are really one of the milestones on the way to COP30, the annual, global climate talks that will kick off in late November in Brazil. So this is all sort of a lead up to that. And I think he's got a tough challenge, but I think he's up to the job. And I think what we heard this week from Lula was promising.
All right. Well, you can read Amy's story on New York Climate Week on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. Thank you so much, Amy.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Great to be here.
All right. For now, we're going to take one quick break. When we come back, I'll talk with Dennis Price about growing examples and evidence of impact driving financial returns.
Sign up for Impact Alpha's free weekly newsletter, Impact Alpha Open, a crisp, expert-curated investment briefing that lifts up people, data, tools, trends, and job opportunities to help you stay ahead of the curve. Find the alpha in impact. Visit impactalpha.com/open to learn more.
Finally this week, I'm joined by Impact Alpha CEO Dennis Price, who had a piece in Tuesday's LPGP newsletter about the alpha in impact, even for those who shun the impact label. Welcome back to the podcast, Dennis.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be here.
Now, you were in both Singapore and London last week. What did you learn about the state of impact investing from all the different conversations you had with people in those places?
Yeah, Brian, I mean, conference season is in full swing. Impact Alpha is expanding our coverage of impact investing in Asia as well as Europe, and this time via London. I would say in Singapore, there's sort of a mobilization, almost feels like among asset owners and LPs, and particularly families there. And so there was an event being held by TPC, which is a maritime company in Singapore that has sort of an umbrella of organizations, including a family office, the Tsao family office. So really bringing together the ecosystem there and what they called Impact Week, where folks were really, teeing up Asia as an Asian institutions and families as potential leaders in this moment, as sort of the U.S. is in retreat mode and Europe is complicated, and so the vibe there was good, and I would say there is capital sort of looking for strategies across the world.
All right, so that's Singapore. What was the scene like in London?
In London, it's vibrant, Brian. I was able to attend 2 events on 2 different days. Both LPGP related events. The first one more sort of responsible GPs and LPs sort of dabbling in impact, and then the other one sort of squarely impact focus. And I would say, the GPs in particular are struggling with sort of the backlash to ESG and diversity on the one hand. You have asset owners sort of shuffling funds amongst continents and managers, as we've been reporting. And so GPs are really trying to find their way. I think on the impact side, has been somewhat unscathed, I would say, by the backlashes, but sort of carries its own reputation and baggage. And so I think GPs and the LPs in the room are really digging in on what are they really trying to do in the investment ecosystem, in venture capital, and figure out exactly what that is.
So then you wrote a piece reflecting on those trips and those experiences. And one of the takeaways I was compelled by in your piece was this idea of impact as a source for alpha or financial outperformance, rather than just as a label for an investment approach. So tell us more about this idea of impact as an alpha source.
Yeah, so it's a theme we're seeing sort of across geographies and I think sort of bubbling up in the sector. I was in one session at the Frame conference, which is held by what's now known as Reframe Venture, formerly Venture ESG, and the conversation was around how VCs are measuring and managing their impact. A speaker after speaker were just talking about the ways that they are using impact strategies, VCs working with companies to drive value through the enterprise and grow value through actually delivering impact. So I raised a question, because there was funds that weren't labeled as impact there. So why, if you really are using impact as the underlying strategy, why aren't you touting that? For me, it sort of became a 2-day exploration into that exact question. Whereas you had these non-impact funds claiming impact strategies. At the same time, you had impact funds talking about some of the challenges they've had with that label and the baggage that it comes with. Assumptions around concessionary returns is one of them. Lengthy due diligence process is another. Whereas you sort of pulled away those layers and got down to actual drivers of value, the impact strategies that the non-impact funds and the impact funds were executing were actually the drivers of value. And folks seem to be leaning into that.
Yeah, that gets back to this idea of impact incognito, the phrase I've used for a long time to kind of cover this concept of that perception bias around the impact label. And people say, well, I know that impact is a driver for financial performance, but maybe I can't raise the funds that I need to with the impact label. So I'm just going to raise the funds I can and deploy capital with this strategy. So can you give us an example of a fund manager who doesn't use the impact label to describe their fund, but is having an impact through their portfolio companies that they invest in?
Great. Yeah. So for example, there was an IPO last week. I guess it was 2 weeks ago at this point. A transition tech or mobility company called Via went public on the New York Stock Exchange, something like $3.5 billion in value. And if you look at the underlying way that they were, talking about what they do or actually what they were doing in practice, it's very impact oriented and strategic in that sense. But they weren't using the word impact. And in fact, one of their major investors, Patango, a Tel Aviv-based generalist tech fund, not an impact fund, had sort of internal impact working group that would work with companies to drive value through executing on impact strategies. And for example, there was a decision point at Via a few years ago to sort of shutter their direct-to-consumer ride-sharing programs and really start partnering with public mobility programs. So schools and cities that were trying to expand access to transportation via ride sharing, and that was so on the one hand for them, they were trying to expand access to shared mobility into communities that didn't have it. That opened up a whole market for them. They became sort of the partner of choice for public transit in over 500 partners at that point, in 35 countries. So digging in on expanding access to mobility, what we would call an impact, was just a strategy for them. So it's just an example of the value in things like affordability or accessibility, opening up markets, creating new customers, sticky customers, that ultimately for this company drove ultimate $1 billion valuation.
All right, so that's an example of a fund that doesn't identify as an impact fund, but having a real impact in one of their portfolio companies. But how does this play out for funds that do self-identify as an impact fund?
Exactly. I mean, that's sort of the beautiful thing here. Is like there's an industry that has been built over the last few decades that is driving towards this exact value proposition. So some of the folks that were there, Berlin-based Masawa is a sort of health tech or mental health fund that one of their strategies is to actually work on the mental health of the founder to like overcome burnout in a way. So not only sort of the solution focus on mental health, but actually driving it through the company they're investing in. Another company, Ada Ventures in London, they have sort of this inclusion alpha thesis where they're investing in founders in markets that are sort of overlooked by traditional investors. They deploy a network of diverse scouts, so women, people of color, to find companies that they may not otherwise be able to find. I think my favorite example is a Lagos-based company, Ingressive Capital, which is saying, they're investing in all over Africa in various opportunities, and are saying, it's African-led companies, African-built companies that are going to solve Africa's problems. And so one way to both ensure that, but also reward the folks involved, they require every company they invest in to have what they call indigenous ownership or local ownership, and they do that by requiring all of the firms to have an ESOP, sort of an employee ownership structure that gives employees ownership, and it's working. They've had 4 exits. Later this year, they're going to publicly list a company. So making sure they're considering the employees of those companies and the wealth generated there is sort of captured locally is part of their impact strategy.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's research and enough data and enough experiences now to demonstrate this shift in the narrative and shift in the frame of impact, that it actually can be a driver of financial outperformance and not just a concessionary trade-off.
Exactly. And I love the way Mark Newberg, who shared the article on LinkedIn, put it. He said that you're using economics as a reason to implement impact rather than argue against it. So it is flipping the sort of reputation on its head. And the point I was making is like lean into not the label, but the word. Like if the impact is actually delivering the value, let's reframe impact to do that. So it felt like these VCs, these GPs, responding to the times, and then we're seeing also Climate Week. Tom Steyer, who you featured earlier, is saying there's a bit of a vibe shift at Climate Week where the moral argument, which is always still there, but it's not sort of what's being put forth, is that they're winning on the underlying economics of climate: cheaper, faster, better. So that seems to be playing out in the impact space as well.
All right. Well, you can read Dennis's full article about impact driving portfolio performance on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But for now, that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks, Brian.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For Amy Cortese and Dennis Price, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the impact advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more impact.